Light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. I always encourage my viewers in a number of shows I've said that if you disagree with anything I say or if you have a different perspective or opinion, you are absolutely invited to come on the show and share with viewers your perspective and your understanding as well. There are a lot of terms that I use that may be inflammatory or even offensive to people, not because I mean to be offensive, but because I believe that important subjects need to be discussed. There was a basic rule for me growing up, and probably for most people, that in society or in social settings one is not supposed to discuss religion, politics, or let's see if I can remember what the third one was. And off the top of my head I don't. Religion or politics were the two that you weren't supposed to discuss because there was always a concern that it might lead to an argument, and arguments for some reason were to be avoided at all costs. The problem with that, of course, is that we never learned to have civil, mature dialogues about sensitive and important subjects. But part of that is being able to accept that people have a wide variety of perspectives and opinions, and that there is nothing inherently wrong about being about any particular opinion, and that each person should be able to say why they believe what they do and allow others to say that, well, how do you deal with the implication or the consequence that, whatever. You know, that if you take this opinion, doesn't that also mean that you would have to, you know, to be consistent, you'd have to make this choice, and that's really not a wonderful choice to make. So it's the ongoing dialogue where humanity individually and collectively is forever refining its ideas and coming to better ways of problem solving and of discerning what is right and what is wrong within any very specific situation. Various rules have tried to categorize problems to say if this ever happens, this is the way you always answer it. And of course that's very problematic, which is why we have a judicial system with judges to consider whether this particular case has extenuating circumstances that would recommend a different choice or a different conclusion than what is normally taken in this sort of circumstance. In this and in relating to people also, one of the themes that I keep coming back to and that I keep telling people is don't chase the categories. There is no individual who is the embodiment of a category. There's no one white person who can represent all white people. There's no one black person who can represent all black people. There's no one Native American who can represent all Native Americans. There's all sorts of different groups of people, and these are real people, and they deserve just as much respect as anybody else. But they may not fall easily into the established categories, and they may not be homogeneous enough that you could make one statement that genuinely applied to all of them. In trying to chase the categories, what we come back to is saying, if someone identifies themselves by a political party, I recently recorded a show in which I mentioned having perspectives that were consistent with democratic socialism. And yet, I think if I went to a convention of democratic socialists where there was 100 other democratic socialists in the room, it probably wouldn't take me more than 10 minutes to get into a heated discussion with someone, because they would have one opinion and I would have another, even though we speculated or perceived or thought that this categorical label might apply in some way to both of us. Even within a small Southern Baptist church in the southeastern United States, in a congregation of less than 40 people, I'm sure there are still things about which they argue. No group is sufficiently homogeneous that any statement can go forever unchallenged. It doesn't mean that we have to stop talking altogether, though. The dialogue is how we learn. But we have to understand that these categories are necessary for conversation. They're necessary to talk about ideas. But when we step from being intellectual and considering it as an idea or as a hypothesis, a possible, and say, here's an individual. How is this individual like the category we've defined? It was kind of like when I was in graduate school earning my master's degree in theological studies, and I was always hearing people attacking white people. White people are this, and white people are this, and white people are to blame for yada, yada, yada. And I said, what is a white person? And the person looked at me for a moment like, how could you not know? And then proceeded to go on for 5 minutes describing this list of characteristics. And when they got to the end of their list, I looked at them and I said, and nothing you have mentioned has anything to do with my actual life experience. So if I'm not a white person, according to your definition, what am I? And so ever since then, whenever I fill out some form that says, what race are you, I check other, because it's undetermined. What I find more often is people want to use the categories as a club to attack each other, and that really doesn't accomplish anything good. The person who could be your collaborator and your teammate thereby becomes your adversary, and you yourself are the one who is doing the divide and conquer strategy. But because by dividing yourself from someone who might otherwise help you, you have to do something all on your own that could be done by two people instead. We need the categorical labels in order to have conversations. I understand that. But we also, every bit as important, is to understand that the categorical labels do not directly apply to any individual we will ever meet. That every individual we will ever meet has a collection or package or an integration of diverse, unique characteristics, ways in which they are like the definitions we have assigned to the category, and ways in which they are completely different from the definitions that we have assigned to the category. I was speaking with a black woman in Dallas on a commuter train at one point in the past, and we were having this fascinating conversation about societal perceptions and in comparison to actual realities, and after a point she said, I've never met a poor white person before. And I thought, well, that's very interesting. But of course, I grew up in a poor and working class environment in the far north, so to me, the wealthy white people were the exception. And in conversation, people sometimes like to refer to the WASP mentality, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. It's kind of a description of a mentality that seems common, especially in the northeastern part of the United States. But even when you go there, you have to understand that each individual you meet may have certain things in common with that categorization and certain things that make them distinct. The challenge with these categories is that we use them in conversation to further our understanding and our knowledge and build our relationships, but we do not project them onto any individual in ways that destroy relationship and that curtail and hinder and discourage communication and understanding, ways that discourage mutual respect. If you see and close to categorization is this idea or practice, I guess, of seeing something or having an experience and wondering whether that experience or perception, though I guess a lot of people don't wonder, they immediately assume that what happened to them is normative, that if I experience this kind of interaction with a black person or a Hispanic person or a Latino or a Polynesian or an Asian or whatever category you want to name, that somehow what I experienced is somehow normative, that every other person of that category that I meet, whom I meet, will behave in a similar sort of way, when in fact they're all different. They're as different as so-called white people. And I guess the word Caucasian actually refers to people coming from the Caucasus Mountains, which doesn't apply to the majority of Europeans. But we use words because we want to have conversations. The challenge is using those labels in ways that empower conversations rather than make them divisive and hostile. So that when someone says, I believe this, instead of saying, how could you possibly, that's so stupid, to instead say, oh really, and what supports that, or what led you to that conclusion? And the more you understand the person with whom you're speaking, the more possible it becomes, in spite of 100 ways you may be different. The more possible it becomes for you to collaborate with that person. But the more you also know in what areas they will not be able to collaborate. That if you are dealing with a very Orthodox Jew, you don't invite them to a dinner where you're going to be serving ham. That if someone identifies as a vegan, you don't show up and offer them something that has honey on it. In knowing what the generalities of the categories are, it gives us a place to begin. You may, in fact, meet someone who says, well, I'm mostly a vegan, but I do use honey. Or I'm mostly a vegan, but I do drink dairy milk. And someone else might say, well, then you're not really a vegan, you're a vegetarian. Well, I think we need to leave it to each individual to choose whichever labels they want to use. But the point of all labels is to understand that they are not the definitive way of knowing what qualities or characteristics you will find within that person. That beyond the labels, the label gives you a starting point, but the individual conversation has to begin there and say, if you're really interested in knowing how unique is this person. Most vegetarians do this and such. Do you? Most black people whom I've met seem to have a fondness for. Does that describe you? I had a black friend who lived in Lubbock, Texas at one point, who said that he did not consider himself an African American because he'd never been to Africa and knew nothing about it. And I said, okay, however you want to define yourself is fine with me. I just want to be respectful, so feel free to educate me, because I'm here to listen and learn, and I do have respect for you, and so I want that respect that I have for you to be evident within my language. But if I don't know the first thing about you, it becomes very problematic. And yet in that, it also remains important to allow for disagreement and to allow for different opinion. I sometimes cross wires with some of my transgender friends because I maintain that trans women are not women and trans men are not men. There's men, there's women, there's trans men, and there's trans women. And now in trying to evolve the language, in some circles they have added something called cis something, C-I-S, and I can't remember if it's cis male, cis female, or cis man, cis woman. And I asked someone where in the world that came from, and they gave me the explanation, but it was so long and convoluted that I can't even begin to remember it. But it makes language unwieldy, and so except for those situations where the people insist on that, I generally don't fall into using that language. Not because I'm trying to be disrespectful, simply because I'm trying to keep language effective. But to me, and this, because I have some trans woman friends who agree with me completely and some who are on the other side of the fence and completely disagree. The ones with whom I agree, we've had this conversation, and I said, well, the thing that separates a trans woman from a woman is that a trans woman has not known and will never know what it is to live with a menstrual cycle, and will never know what it is to be pregnant. On the flip side, as my friend Crystal says, the Gigi, the genetic girl, Gigi's will never know what it is to look at the world through the eyes of the opposite gender, to actually be someone in, I don't want to say the wrong body, the opposite body, to be someone who has experienced, not just read about as an intellectual construct, but someone who has actually experienced what it is to be out of sync with your physical body, to know yourself to be a woman on the inside and to find yourself to be male on the outside, and to go through the very difficult struggle of bringing the two into harmony and integration and synchronicity, and something that allows you to be a whole, healthy person according to your own self-chosen definitions and labels. But again, labels and categories, all of this is about conversation in public places and how we talk about things with each other. And we need to be careful in using these terms that we don't presume the same understanding in the other, but also that if they do have a different understanding, we don't berate them for not having the same understanding that we do. There are advantages and disadvantages to every perspective. It is by dialogue that we learn how those uniquenesses can be integrated and interwoven to be the most empowering to everyone present, rather than having them be stumbling blocks scattered all over the floor that leave us at odds with each other instead of working as a team. I think when people finally understand what the real issues are, well, to borrow a Bible verse, you shall know the truth and the truth shall make you free. When we know what is true in a situation, what is true about a specific individual, and how categorical labels contain general perceptions, but they really don't contain that much specific truth. If you want specific truth, you have to go to an individual and say, how did it feel? How did you respond? What did you do? How did you resolve it? What do you need? All those sorts of questions that convey that I value you, I respect you, I care about you, I want to be supportive of you, but I do not have experience with you. And so until you educate me enough about yourself, you're going to have to be patient with my stumblings and with me using the wrong terminology and so forth. What is frustrating to me in trying to say a person is a person is a person every time I can, and to value every person equally, not hierarchically as who's better or worse than whom or who suffered the most. No, there's no competition. A person is a person is a person. Everyone deserves to have their needs met. Everyone deserves to be loved. Everyone deserves the ability to reach for, if not to actually reach, their highest and greatest potential. I absolutely love the movie Hidden Figures, where it was some very gifted black women who were involved in the NASA program and all the ridiculous behavior and small-minded rules they had to deal with along the way. But thank goodness they stuck it out and were recognized by a few important individuals as having the gifts that they did. And that opened doors that when they were able to walk through calmly and confidently and competently, blew everybody's minds. I love the scene in Hidden Figures where the manager, played by Kevin Costner, hands a piece of chalk to this black woman and says, "Why don't you show us, Mary?" And she very tentatively takes the chalk and walks to the board and realizes everyone is staring at her. Of course they should be. And then she forgets all that and begins to do what she knows. And she covers that board in all kinds of higher math equations that I can't begin to understand, and comes up with the exact answer that they needed for this question that they thought was unanswerable. And she shows them right there on the blackboard how to find the answer and what the answer is. And everyone is just kind of sitting there staring with their mouth open. And I wanted to just jump up in the theater and applaud because I thought it was such a wonderful demonstration. And I'm so glad that that opportunity happened. But that comes again and again throughout human life for every single one of us, I think. Too often we see each other according to categories and not according to the individuals that we are. And we don't give each other a chance to show what we know and what we can do and to share the best that we have to give. Whatever categorical labels I use in conversation, I ask that you be patient and not change the channel or get all upset with me because I said that label, whatever it was, and consider what's behind it. What makes that? What is the definition of it? And how many different definitions are there? Because when I first figured out I was gay, it was the first time in my life when all the pieces began to come together. And I kind of looked in the mirror and said, oh, well, now it all makes sense. Why didn't somebody tell me? But of course, it's not the sort of thing that you can tell someone. It's the sort of thing that people need to be able to find out on their own in the best possible way instead of being discouraged from ever knowing themselves. But at that point, I didn't know what being gay meant. I didn't know what it meant to be gay. And so I started talking with everyone I could about what does it mean and how do you define relationships and expectations and aspirations and how do you define that of which you believe yourself to be capable? How do you define your own capabilities? That there's things you can do and things you can't do and things you shouldn't do unless you're ready for a lot of trouble. At one point in time, it was extremely recommendable for gay and lesbian people not to become elementary school teachers because the surrounding society was not ready to accept such people. I like to think we have moved to a point where in most places across the country, it doesn't matter anymore. We're over that. We're past that. And we can now understand that this class is not about dealing with sexuality. This class is about teaching science or social studies or foreign language or art or music or English language or whatever, history, philosophy, whatever. It's not about who you are in your private life. It's your ability to convey an understanding to a classroom full of students. The problem, though, is when we look at each other and we see the categories and we're blinded to the individual. And we see someone and he says, oh, I'm a Republican. And you say, you're a what? because of what we think the word Republican means. And we need to get in the habit of stopping before we say that and say, oh, what does that mean to you? And listen to the explanation. And if it seems to be going in a direction that makes us uncomfortable, to say, well, how does that resolve this issue? Or how would you resolve this issue if it crossed your path? And the more we begin to understand how that person thinks, the more we have a chance of being respectful friends or collaborators. And if we're not going to be friends, that's fine, but at least we can still conduct ourselves with respect. And to the extent that we give respect to others, we have a much better chance of expecting that we will be respected in turn. To the extent that we do not respect others, we have no legitimate right to expect anyone to respect us. It's the basic golden rule drawn from the Bible that is evident within every belief system around the world, that garbage in, garbage out. What you give, you receive. What you plant, you reap. It's the same basic dynamic. The unfortunate frustration to me is when people want to look at this dynamic that is so pervasive around the world and insist that because of that, whatever you put out will come back to you. And it doesn't always work that way, because we've got literally millions of people with millions of different opinions, all competing, all sharing a resource, sharing the same planet. The point I want to leave all of you with is just to remember that the categories are for conversation. The individuals are where you find the truth. And I would really encourage everyone to take the time to ask more questions in a non-threatening way, in a way that seeks information and seeks understanding. That you can be completely different from someone and still get along. It really is possible, but it's not going to happen by accident. Thank you very much for watching.